Thanks, folks, for joining. My name is William Patton. I'm a Wiz Solutions Engineering Manager, and today I appreciate your time as I talk about cloud security modernization and specifically about cloud security operationalization. So let's get into it. Cloud has been the single largest transformation for security. This is something that developers and ops teams have already been going through for over a decade, and now security is being asked to operate at that same velocity. And why that is because cloud has unlocked a completely new environment. This is now outside of our four walls. This is outside of our control over the networks, security, storage, and that enables new features and functions that those developers and ops teams are taking advantage of. And now security is being asked to get into that environment, operate at that same velocity, while also being responsible for the security of all those new features and functions and with that new velocity that's unlocking them. And that creates new risks. That's the key to cloud security in the modern age. That is why we're being asked to operate at this velocity, because cloud providers and tools are unlocking new features and functions faster and faster every single day, which creates new risks. We can no longer simply operate on our traditional tooling of vulnerability management or externally exposed ports, firewall rule reviews. Those no longer scale to cloud, because new tools like AI and others are coming every single day and more quickly at a greater and greater scale, which creates new risks. Now things that didn't relate to each other in that traditional on-prem model are now unlocking new risks in cloud that attackers are exploiting. And that is all tied back to ultimately this new ownership model. Because of those new features and functions in this new environment, and because of the rapid speed of change that's creating those new risks, this has also unlocked a completely new ownership model. Now those ops teams, admin teams, dev teams, they own these compute, network, storage, security tools. They own the deployment and change and ultimately decommissioning of that, which completely changes the experience security has in interaction with those teams. And so we need to get security ingrained in that. We need to build that in as a seamless function within that operation so that it isn't a department of no, stop, start, as we were used to doing it before cloud. That has unlocked a new model. And what we need to do is change our thinking around how we do that, because what we've tried to do traditionally in security is extend our solutions from on-prem, right? We try to take what we're used to. We try to take things like vulnerability management tools and external exposure tools and expand them out to cloud. But that creates friction, right? These tools are constantly evolving and adapting and adopting new functions and features that don't operate in that model. And then we typically pivot to using native tools, right? Individual point tools per cloud. How do I secure AWS? I'll use AWS tools, Azure tools. But that creates a skills gap. It creates a visibility gap. Now I've got features and functions only targeted at individual cloud features or functions as well. And that creates that siloed point solution problem that we're used to, right? And then the final thing is we try to build it ourselves. All right, I understand now I've got these gaps. How do I build these tools to fit into those gaps? How do I bridge those tools, maybe using a combination of those on-prem traditional tools and native tools? And that creates the problem of, again, now we're trying to keep pace with the cloud provider's velocity. That is a recipe for creating a further and further gap that allows security to fall behind, and we no longer have that visibility. And so if we change that mindset to a risk-based approach, this is how we operationalize cloud security. This is the key, because this is how we get the signal through the noise. And this is what we're used to now with cloud. We've seen this over the last decade, that raw amount of telemetry, that raw amount of services and functions or vulnerabilities, right, is just escalating and growing. The number of vulnerabilities in 0 days only continues to escalate as well. And so we get that large amount, but then we start to apply those risk-based analysis tools to it with things like threat intelligence. All right, we've got 260,000 vulnerabilities. How do I prioritize which one to operate on first? Now I can get that down to 2.4 thousand. All right, that's still too much for me to take action on. How do I move that forward? And so again, pulling it together with things like probability or likelihood, things that we operate in and we normalize as part of our day-to-day job, now expanding that out to those dev and ops teams. Now they can understand, hey, that vulnerability with that public exploit in this particular combination of these 23 that are publicly exposed to the internet, that creates a toxic combination. That creates something we need to really take action on. But ultimately, it's going to come down to them and the business of what is the impact? Why do I care about those 23? Which do I care most about? And so this is where then we can apply something like access to data. Buckets and databases contain the crown jewels, contain the information that run our business. And this is where we can apply that impact methodology to ultimately create an actionable list for that business. Okay, these are the 12 we need you to take action on. And again, going back to that ownership, they're the one having to do it. They're the one having to take action. So we need to target and focus their efforts when they move forward. When they take action, they need to understand why. They need to understand the priority of when they need to take action and how. And so as part of that, we need to think about this as democratization. That's how we operationalize this. You see that on the left-hand side. Now the security team and that dev team are both operating in that self-service model, but now the security team has got that central visibility and control, but they have to ultimately rely on those dev teams or ops teams or AI teams to take that action. And so we need to provide them as part of this checklist on the right-hand side. We need to provide them with what I was just saying, that visualization. Why do I care? Support it with evidence. This is why this vulnerability with this exploit, publicly exposed with this access to data, that creates guidance for them of, okay, now I understand why. And now we need to create that virtuous cycle to really operationalize this, provide them with the remediation. Cybersecurity is not what dev teams and ops teams are traditionally trained in. They don't come at it every day. So we need to help provide them with that. We can't simply point out what's bad. We have to help them remediate it and ultimately now operate in that model where they have been for some time in code, right? How do we not just fix this in the code, but how do we prevent it going forward? Create that automation, create that cycle. That will create that operationalization that allows us to scale the cybersecurity organization in coordination with operations and administration. And so what does this look like visually? And you'll notice on the right-hand side, we've got that proactive and reactive above the line and below the line. This is where we can, again, pull together that security posture first, constantly analyzing the environment, constantly be evaluating what is the posture of the environment because it's constantly changing. Whether they're making changes, the cloud providers are also making changes, and so is the environment around it. Threat actors are changing, software is changing, the cloud provider itself is changing, whether we are taking action or not. So we need to be doing that risk analysis constantly and providing that information to that dev and ops teams immediately. And then for us, we need to also enrich that and understand who's doing what with the environment. We need to pull that in as part of that. Okay, we understand the risk profile. We understand why that's risky. Who's doing what with it? And we need to help analyze that and provide that information more quickly to that cyber defense team, that SOC, that IR, in those tools that they're used to, SIMs, SOARs, other tooling that they've brought to the table. We need to do that as well. That needs to be intrinsic to this whole thing. But then, like I said, the real key is we also need to bring in that code security. This creates the cycle. This is what allows us to all communicate transparently and be able to do it again at scale, be able to operationalize fixing it in code, and then ultimately remediating and preventing ultimately those issues from coming around. So that creates that cycle. This is how we can all communicate in a methodology that we all understand and can all see. We now understand the rules of the road. We know how to deploy, and we know the actions that we took, why they were risky, and what was the outcome of that. And so this is what will allow that cycle to get started. And this is as part of that maturity framework where we can now build that virtuous cycle. So typically along the left-hand side, this is where a lot of folks are. This is where a lot of folks have been for a long time because we're still struggling with gaining that visibility because we're doing things like we talked about earlier, approaching it with traditional on-prem tools and agents and server deployments, right? That was really hard to scale to multi-cloud, and it's even harder to manage in real time ongoing. And so we get that visibility first. We create that multi-cloud visibility through modern cloud security tools. And now we need to reduce that risk. This is where we first start to take those actions, first start to categorize. You saw that breakdown, right? Taking that noise and ultimately driving it down to signal. These are the things that are most critical for us to focus on. We're going to take action on these first. And we build that maturity through that reduced critical risk. And then this is where we get into that cycle. Now those teams have become comfortable. Now they understand it. They trust the tools. They've got full visibility and there's transparency and trust built between the teams. Now we can start to work on that democratization. Now we can give those dev and ops teams direct access to our tooling. Traditionally, not something we do, right? Now we can allow them to self-service their own security as part of the self-service of their own cloud tools, of their own code platforms. And again, now we start to build that out. Now we can meet in the middle with that develop securely. And this is a new muscle that security teams are being asked to stretch with operating in code. I need to now interact with Git repos. I need to interact with Terraform, IAC, and some of these other primitives that are cloud native. That's what dev and ops teams have been doing. Now we're being asked to do that. And the key is ultimately that respond to threats, because we are the ones that are tasked with that. And so as part of learning that new muscle memory within developing securely, we need to do the same thing as part of our threat management and threat analysis. And so we build those workflows and build that response framework, and now provide that rule of the road back. And this creates that framework. Now we can interact back and forth across that in a transparent manner so that everyone understands this is the risk, this is what's happened as a result of that, and now we can fix that in code and meet in the middle. And that's how we really truly scale that cloud security and transparent operations of cybersecurity. So hopefully I left you with some ideas today. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the summit. There's a lot of information being shared today. Thank you for your time.